The meeting has now begun.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here with us today. My name is Abdel Jaybar. I'm a supports engineer here at GrandStream Networks. In today's webinar, we'll talk about the security measures that are recommended to implement when deploying GrandStream UCM. So during the presentation, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A area, and we will have some time towards the end to answer all your questions. So the presentation together with the Q&A should take us 40 to 45 minutes. So let's get started. This is the agenda of today's webinar. So we're going to talk a little bit about the general security practices that are recommended. Then we will talk about how to secure the web access of the UCM and how to make your extension more secure. We're going to describe a little bit how to secure media as well as signaling, and I'm talking about SIP and RTP. Then a brief description of fail to ban and how it works on the UCM. Then we will jump to the web UI of the UCM so we can talk and describe all the features, the security features available on the UCM. So before we dive into the security settings and features available on the UCM, I have a few slides that I would like to show you. So the first one is about the general security practices that should be considered when deploying the UCM, and most of them are about securing the perimeter and especially the firewall or the router. So these security measures can be implemented individually or in combination depending on the elements involved in the deployment. And in general, these security recommendations comprise the perimeter setup and the UCM configuration, which we will explain during the live demo. Usually, I would say you do not need to have expensive and sophisticated devices to protect your UCM from external attacks. Always what you need is a security approach that requires understanding the types of potential attacks and how to prevent them. Because attackers are often on the lookout for easy targets and that have weak or no security at all. So the more security you add to your network, the harder it gets for hackers to penetrate your system. So the most important security rule is always place the UCM behind the firewall or a router with advanced firewall features. You can configure the firewall or the router to allow traffic only from legitimate sources like your SIP provider or remote users, and deny traffic to anyone else who is not authorized to connect or talk to the UCM. However, if you have users running soft phones like GSWave or other third-party soft phones, this approach may not be optimal because mobile devices constantly change IP addresses, and the firewall will eventually block traffic from the source mobile devices. And another wise thing to do when you install the UCM is change the default ports used by the UCM. For example, it has been noticed that most SIP attacks are carried on the SIP UDP port 5060. My recommendation to installers is always to change this port to a different port number other than 5060. You can change it to, I don't know, like 9056 or 5690. but just change it from 50/60. And the same thing applies to the web access using TCP port number 8089 for HTTPS. I strongly recommend to change it as well. And if you only access the web interface from the LAN side, you can just go ahead on the firewall and block that port so nobody will be able to access the UCM from an external IP. This way, when you do this, only users that know the HTTPS port will have access to the login page. So if you change it from 8089 and you disable the HTTP port redirection, people when they type in the IP address of the UCM in the web browser search bar, the UCM login page will not show up because they have to put in the right port number. So making these simple changes will tremendously reduce the chances of having a UCM being attacked or hacked. And another thing, always ensure that your UCM is running the latest version available. Sometimes when there is a vulnerability, and the fix for that vulnerability is always included in the firmware release. So in the previous slide, I mentioned that you should have the ports used by the UCM open on the firewall. And by default, the UCM uses port 5060 for your SIP, 8089 for HTTPS, and it also uses the UDP port range 10,000 to 20,000 for RTP. RTP is a real-time transport protocol, which is the protocol used to carry audio traffic. So most of the time I see installers open these ports, and I'm talking about the range 10,000 to 20,000 on the firewall to allow audio. My piece of advice to you, never open these ports on the firewall unless you have to. And the following slide depicts how a call takes place. And I will use this example to further explain why you do not need to open the RTP ports on the firewall. So as some of you might already know, SIP works in conjunction with RTP, or real-time transport protocol. So while SIP deals with setting up, controlling, and terminating the call session, RTP uniquely deals with carrying the media or the audio traffic. And during the exchange of the SIP messages, the SIP user agents, and I mean by this the ITSP SIP server and the UCM, they exchange the port numbers that will be used to send the RTP traffic or the audio traffic. So let's stick to the example that we have in front of us. So the UCM is asking the SIP server to send the RTP traffic on port 12,345. And unfortunately, when the SIP server sends RTP on the requested port, the firewall will discard or will drop the packets because the port number 12,345 is closed, and the firewall has no way of knowing that the UCM is actually requesting traffic on that specific port. That is the reason why installers and even VoIP engineers would ask you to have these ports open on the firewall. So after I explained the reason why you are told to have these ports open on the firewall, now let me tell you my reasons why you do not need to do that on the firewall. So when SIP establishes the call, and let's look at the example number 2. When SIP establishes the call, the RTP media immediately starts flowing in both directions using the negotiated port numbers for RTP. And when I say immediately, I mean by that a fraction of a second. So when the UCM sends traffic out of the RTP port, the router or the firewall will automatically add disconnection to the NAT table And eventually, when audio from the ITSP is received, the router will check the NAT table to find the original source address of the packet from which the UCM on the LAN side originally started the connection. And as a result, the firewall passes that audio to the UCM. And the only issue here that you're going to face is if the remote party, and we're talking about the ITSP, sends the audio first. But I would not consider that an issue because we are talking about few RTP packets that might be rejected. And if you count that, it's less than half a second because each RTP packet carries only 20 milliseconds of audio. In other words, if the firewall blocks the first 5 RTP, you just lost like 100 milliseconds of audio. And I don't believe that's important compared to the benefits that you get from blocking these ports on the firewall. Okay, so now let's take this a step further. In the example in front of us, we have a UCM configured with call forwarding to an external number. So once you call the UCM and the UCM receives the call from the iPhone, it will automatically forward it to the Android phone. When the call is established, the RTP traffic from both directions, I mean the iPhone and the Android, is coming from the outside network. And logically, the firewall will reject it, and you will end up with no audio, even if the call is established. So in case you experience this issue, there is a feature in the UCM built specially to allow incoming audio traffic to pass the firewall when you have call forwarding enabled on the inbound routes. This feature is named RTP Keepalive, and it can be configured under PBX settings, SIP settings, TOS. The way this feature works is after the SIP session is established, the UCM will send an RTP Keepalive packet to the IP address and a port number for RTP included in the connection information in the SIP message. So the process described in the previous slide will be used again. In other words, when the UCM sends the Keepalive out of the RTP port, the router or firewall will automatically add this connection to the NAT table and open the defined RTP port. I hope that's clear. Next, we move to the web access and how to secure the login. Of course, the first rule is when you receive the UCM, change the default password. And when you change the default password, try to adopt a complex and strong passwords that includes numbers, characters, lowercase and uppercase, and also special characters. If you have a UCM from the latest batch, some of them, they come with a unique password, and the password is included in the tag on the back of the UCM. Also, as I mentioned in the first slide, change the port number of the HTTPS. The second thing, and I'm going to show you this when we go through the web UI of the UCM, disable port redirect. And another thing that I always recommend is the UCM has the super admin user with the username admin, which is configured by default on the UCM with factory settings. And super admin has access to all the UCM pages, and it can execute any operation available on the UCM, like upgrade, backup, and reset the system. My advice is always leave the super admin aside and create another admin password. And with that admin password, that's the one that you're going to be using all the time to log into the UCM, unless you have to do some upgrade or reset or take the backup. The reason why I'm saying this is because sometimes people, they use the web browser. The web browser Some of them, if you have that option to cache the passwords and the login information, that can jeopardize the security of your UCM, especially if you're using a computer that is used by multiple people. And when you have the browser cache that information, other people, they can log it into the UCM and they can reset the whole thing, or change or take the backup of your UCM and then upload it on another ROG UCM and start making and receiving calls from your UCM. That's why it's important, as I mentioned, when you log in for the first time, change the password associated with the super admin, then create another admin user and assign it, of course, a complex and strong password. And then if you need to access the web access of the UCM from the outside network, make sure you configure a rule on the firewall, so that especially if you have a static IP, you can configure the firewall to allow only your static IP address to log in to the UCM remotely. There's also the fail to ban for login, and I'm going to show you this when we go through the web UI of the UCM. SIP registration. This concerns the security measures that you need to take when you create extensions. The rule number one, always assign extensions complex passwords. I still see a lot of people that have the UCM accessible from outside, and they still have easy extensions with easy to guess passwords like admin123 and some easy combination. So always make sure that the SIP password associated with the extension is really complex and a long password, at least 12 characters. And there is also the option, which I recommend a lot, is to use the enable strategy. If you go to the extension settings and you go to the media tab, there is an option that says strategy. Strategy is very useful. So if someone has access to the information related to the extension, like the SIP password and the extension number and the IP address used by the UCM, anyone can register to the UCM as long as they can reach the UCM. But if you configure the strategy, you tell the UCM to accept only SIP registration from specific IP addresses or specific subnets. Let's just give you an example. Let's say you have all the extensions located in your private network, and the private network or the IP network is 10.10.10.0. So when you go to the UCM and you configure all the extensions with the strategy media and you include the local subnet, even those who have the right credentials or the authentication password for the extensions will not be able to register to the UCM. The UCM is going to check if the SIP registration attempt is coming from another IP different than the one configured in the strategy. It's going to reject registration automatically. Then we have SRTP. I mentioned earlier what RTP is the protocol responsible for carrying audio traffic. And the audio traffic is, if you capture it with a packet sniffer like Wireshark, you can actually replay the audio and you can listen to the whole conversation. So when confidentiality is really important, you want to go with SRTP, which stands for Secure RTP. So as I mentioned earlier, SIP is used to establish, modify, and terminate calls, and that RTP is the protocol used to carry the media. Because RTP does not provide encryption, phone calls can become vulnerable to eavesdropping and replay if someone is able to capture the traffic on the wire, as I mentioned. That is why sometimes we need to enable SRTP to encrypt the traffic. For example, if the CEO wants to have all his phone calls with the managers to be encrypted, you can select the CEO and the manager's extensions and enable SRTP using the mode enabled but not forced, because we support two modes, as you can see in the slide. This way, if the managers and the CEO call each other, the audio traffic will be encrypted using SRTP. And if they call another user, let's say the receptionist, where confidentiality is not important, SRTP will not be enabled. And encryption in general is a good thing to have because it provides, as I mentioned, confidentiality and privacy. However, the algorithm for encryption is resource intensive and can eat up your CPU resources when SRTP is excessively used. That's why I recommend to use it only when needed, which means, as I mentioned in the example, if the CEO phone conversations are important, you can enable it for the CEO, and then the other ones you can just leave them using the RTP. And if you look at the screenshot, the crypto key used to encrypt the RTP traffic is actually exchanged during the SIP initiation, and we're going to talk about this in this slide. So the same thing that we explained about RTP applies to SIP. SIP information is exchanged in plain text format. This can become a security issue when confidentiality is required because someone with access to the network again and with a packet sniffer can capture these messages and read them and eventually use that information for some malicious purposes. And among the information exchanged with SIP messages is the crypto key used to encrypt the RTP traffic, the one that I showed you right here. And when the crypto key is exchanged in plain text and you have the right tool, like a skilled hacker can decrypt all the traffic, even if you're using SRTP. That is why it is usually recommended to use secure SIP when SRTP is enabled to provide complete confidentiality. And technically speaking, secure SIP is useful because it allows you to send SIP messages in an encrypted format using TLS, which eventually protects the same thing with SRTP against eavesdropping and data tampering. Fail to ban. This is an important feature available on the UCM that protects the UCM by detecting excessive failed SIP requests and login attempts. And when it comes to SIP requests, fail to ban works with against the SIP registration and SIP invite and SIP subscribe. Let me explain how fail to ban works with SIP registration. So if you go to the UCM and you configure the fail to ban with 3 attempts, the UCM, when it receives SIP registration from the same IP and 3 times it fails to register, the UCM is going to use fail to ban to block that IP from registering again. You can configure the ban period by minutes, or you can ban that person or that IP address permanently. And we're going to go through the web interface of the UCM to explain to you how to configure it. And one thing, when you go to the dashboard of the UCM, you have access to the CPU usage. And one thing that you should always pay attention to, when you see like the CPU usage is reaching 100% or 95%, and there is no activity on the UCM, this could be an indication that your UCM is under some kind of attack, either excessive SIP registrations or someone is trying to make calls through the UCM. So always keep an eye on that one. All right, so now let's go ahead and do a quick demo using the web interface of the UCM. So this is, I'm just going to give you an example here. So the IP address of my UCM is 192.168.22.119. So just by typing the IP address, you will notice that the web browser will change it to HTTPS and then port 8089. The reason this happens because I have the redirection for HTTP enabled. So let's start with the HTTP settings. So the first thing, we go to system settings, and this is the feature that the one that changed from 80 to 89 because it's enabled. So I'm going to disable that feature. Then I'm going to change the port to 5059, for example, and then save and apply. So if I try to log in again, this is only cache. So you see that the web browser is not going to work. So for that case, for me, I need to go and change it back and use the port that I just changed it, which is 5059. So that's why it's always recommended to change the default port so that only people who know the HTTPS port will be able to log in to the UCM. Let's go to maintenance. And this is where you need to change the default password. If, for example, the password is admin, you can include it as an old password and then include a long combination of characters and make it as long as you can, something that you can remember, and include all the characters like uppercase, lowercase, special characters, and numbers. And when you do that, you go to login settings, and then you have these options. If you, for example, in front of the web interface of the UCM, most of the time you want to increase that timeout, so you don't have to be kicked out all the time from the web interface of the UCM. But if you only need to check quickly and then leave, you can just decrease it to 10 minutes. Then you have the maximum number of login attempts and the user ban period. By default, it's 5 attempts within 5 minutes. So let me go back here, sorry about that. So I said 5 attempts within 5 minutes. You can increase it, decrease it. For example, I would say if someone tries to log in into the UCM 3 times within 60 minutes, I will tell the UCM to ban that user for 60 minutes. And then you will see the IP address and the username that was used to log into the UCM. So it's always important to configure that one on the UCM so that when people, they try like a brute force attack on the web access of the UCM can block them. And also I mentioned earlier that when you have the super administrator of the UCM, when you log in for the first time, change the password, then create another admin password. Just create add and then choose administrator, give it a name, extension, and password. And that's the username that you need to use all the time to log in to the UCM to do your IP PBX management. Sometimes like you have users and they want to have access to the UCM to control certain features on the UCM, but you don't want to give them like full access to the UCM. You can do that using the custom privilege feature of the UCM. Let me give you an example. Let's say you have the call queue and someone is like the call queue, the call center supervisor wants to have access to the features available in the call queue, but you don't want to give them full access to the UCM. You can create a new user and you can call it, for example, supervisor. And then if he's interested in looking into the CDR and the call queue feature, I can just choose CDR and call queue features, then save and apply. So when I create this privilege profile, now it's available, then I can go ahead and create another user. Then I can call, for example, this is the supervisor named Steve. Then under the privilege, I'm going to choose the supervisor profile that I just created. Then I'm going to put the password and create the whole profile, save and apply. Then I can assign them this username to log into the UCM. So when they log in, they're only going to have access to the CDR and the call queue dashboard and statistics and management related to the call queue. All right, now let's go to the extension and how to secure your extensions. Of course, when you create an extension, always make sure you use a strong password. This is only a test unit, so whatever password I put in there doesn't matter, but make sure you include long and complex passwords. Then you go to media, and this is the feature I was talking to you about, which is called the strategy. Let's say all the phones that I have, they register from this subnet, which is my local subnet, 192.168.22. I can include the subnet in there. So even if someone who has the right SIP credentials to register to the UCM, if they try to register, the UCM is going to reject it, even if they have the right credentials. Then in case you would like to enable SRTP to encrypt the traffic, you have two options. Enabled and forced. That means if you enable that one and force it, that means this extension 1000 will only be able to talk to other extensions that use SRTP. If another extension does not use SRTP, the call will not complete successfully. The second option is enabled but not forced, which means SRTP will always be preferred, but if someone else doesn't use SRTP, the UCM will push it to use the RTP instead. All right, next let's move to PBX settings and the SIP settings, which is right here. So as I mentioned earlier, if you would like to encrypt the SIP signaling protocol, just make sure you enable TLS. And then the port that's going to be used for TLS is 5061. The UCM comes with built-in certificates for TLS in case you would like to upload your own, especially when you have like certificates from a trusted certificate authority. You can actually upload them in here. So you have the option to upload them. So the UCM will be authenticated with the other remote party that is using the TLS. There is an option here that's really important, and I would like to mention this. It's called Allow Guest Calls. This feature should not be enabled unless you have a reason to enable that one, because if you hover over it, this is what it says. If enabled, the UCM will allow unauthorized invites to come into the PBX and allow calls to be established. So if you have that one enabled without the need to have SIP credentials to register to the UCM, I can still be able to make calls from the UCM. So always make sure that setting is not enabled unless you have a reason to enable it. And I don't see any reason why you have to enable it. This feature was included in the UCM because it has been requested by some other applications. That's why it is there. But for you, do not enable that one. And of course, when you make all these changes, you want the UCM, of course, to monitor what's going on so you can receive logs and events. The UCM has the alert event list that you can choose from. You choose the critical ones that are really important to you. So let's say, for example, you have user login failed. You want to know if someone tries to log in into the UCM. I can set that one to on, and then I can set the email notification as well to on. I'm just going to cancel right now. So once you set that one to on, you can go to the alert contact and you can include your email. So every time someone tries to log in to the UCM and they fail because they provide the incorrect credentials to log in, the UCM will generate a log, then it's going to send you an email. So monitoring the activities taking place in the UCM is also another good recommended security approach to use. The next, let's go to the outbound calls and how to secure your outbound calls. First of all, when you create your, let's say this one is for international. When you create your outbound routes, always try to make them as explicitly defined as you can, which means if users are dialing 10 digits, I'm going to include 10 digits. NXX, NXX, X, and then X. So that's 10 digits. If they dial 11 digits, I'm going to include 11 digits. I think that's less than 11. That's less than 10. So some people, because it's very easy and convenient to just put X dot, but when you do it that way, you actually open the outbound routes to any types of numbers, especially when you have, let's say, the trunk allows you to make international call. If someone has access to the UCM or if they have access to one of the extensions, they can register remotely to the UCM and they can start making international calls, which you don't want it to happen. That's why always when you create your patterns, make them as explicitly defined as possible. And also when you use the privilege level, this is another way to manage who can make international calls. For example, this is for international calls, so I'm going to put 011x dot, just an example, and it has the privilege level international. So when I create the extensions, I make sure that all the extensions don't have international privilege, and only those extensions that will be authorized to make international calls from this outbound route has a privilege equal to international. So that's a second way to do it. The third way is you can use the other option, which is enable filter on source caller ID. If this is for international calls and only the managers are allowed to use this outbound route, I can just go to available extensions and choose the extensions of the managers and then save and apply. This is why I secure that this outbound route will not be used by anyone else except the CEO, the owner, and the managers. You can also choose to use the password. And you can configure, for example, this outbound route with a password and disable enable on source. So every time they want to call from this outbound, the UCM is going to prompt them to enter the password. The password applies to all the users, but in case, for example, you want to assign a PIN number to each user, you can go ahead and configure the PIN groups. So in my case, I have one PIN group, it's Europe. And I have one user who is Steve, and his PIN number is 2017. So if I go to the outbound route and I choose, for example, the PIN group Europe, and Steve made a call from this outbound route and I have CDR enabled, I can go to the CDR and I can see actually who made that call, for example, right here. So Steve tried to make this call from the outbound route. It's going to tell me who made the call and which group does he belong to. So it's Steve, but it doesn't show you, for security reasons, it does not show you the PIN number that was used by Steve. It just gives you the name and the group to which he belongs. Another feature that you should be careful when you implement this one, which is the dial trunk. So when you create an IVR and you have the IVR set up as your main IVR and you have the dial trunk feature enabled, people can actually call the IVR and they can start dialing other extensions. This is not recommended. Always set that one to no, unless you have a reason to allow dialing from the trunk. If that is the case, it's okay. You can create you can allow it, for example, to dial a trunk and then give it a privilege level of international or internal or local, something that matches the privilege or lower than the privilege on the outbound route. So when people, they're going to try to call from the IVR, I can also configure the outbound route with the PIN number. So they need to enter the PIN number to call from the IVR. So again, if you don't have those steps taken into consideration, like the privilege level and the outbound route is configured with a PIN number, just try avoid checking the dial trunk from the IVR. So the next step is going to be the static defense or the security settings available on the UCM. So first of all, let's start with static defense and how you can use them to secure your UCM. Some of the options that are available here are ping defense enable. So in case you don't want the UCM to reply back to those ping messages like ICMP echoes and reply back with ICMP reply, you can check that one. However, when you check this one, you disable ping completely. And if you're doing any kind of troubleshooting, the UCM is not going to respond back to those ping requests. So it's up to you. I mean, another thing, if you have the router configured in route mode, which is not the case with my UCM, it's going to give you two options, LAN and WAN. If you don't want people to ping the UCM from external, you can just check the WAN and leave the WAN unchecked. So when you're doing your troubleshooting, you can always ping the UCM from inside. Then we have the SIM flood defense. Just to give you an idea what SIM flood is, it is a form of DOS or denial of service attack in which hackers send an excessive number of TCP SIM requests to the UCM in an attempt to overload and consume its resources. And eventually, the UCM or any other device, this applies also to servers, they become unresponsive and unavailable to legitimate users. For that one, I would now recommend to enable it unless you did some troubleshooting and you notice that someone is scanning your network and they're sending a lot of TCP SYN messages, then I can go ahead and just enable that one. Then you have the ping of death. If you notice something when you use your computer to ping devices, each ping takes few seconds. It doesn't go like that quick. The reason why, because some devices, they might interpret that type of ping, like a quick or excessive number of ping messages, as a ping of death attack. And the ping of death is that they send a very large number of ping messages within a second, and the UCM by default will allow you to send up to 5 ping requests per second, which means if one device is pinging the UCM and it's sending more than 5 ping messages within a second, and you have that one checked, the UCM is gonna drop and discard those ping messages from reaching the UCM. You can also create your own static rules. So let's say you notice that someone is trying to access the UCM remotely, and you would like to create a static rule for that specific IP address. Then you can choose the source IP. For example, if it's attacking the UCM from that specific IP, I can include the specific IP in there, and I can just leave it any. So it doesn't matter which port he's using or which port that IP is trying to access, and it doesn't matter what IP it's trying to access. I'm going to tell the UCM to block that IP, and I'm going to select both UDP and TCP and then save and apply the changes. So next time when this IP tries to talk to the UCM is going to automatically block it. Next, we have dynamic defense. Dynamic defense is enabled to protect the UCM by blacklisting individual hosts that send excessive connection attempts or brute force attacks. This works only, by the way, only when the UCM is in route mode. And dynamic defense's connection threshold and blacklist update interval can be adjusted in accordance with your policy and preferences. And then you can also include the whitelist, the IPs, and the port numbers that you would like to whitelist. Then fail to ban, which is a very important feature to have enabled on the UCM. Always make sure you check that one enabled. As I mentioned, Fail to ban protects your UCM from excessive SIP registration. It's like someone is trying to do a brute force attack on the UCM and is trying to register some malicious devices to the UCM. Fail to ban is going to block that IP from trying more and sending more SIP registration to the UCM. I can, for example, tell the UCM put 0, that means to ban that specific IP permanently. And then I can tell it, for example, if someone tries to log in into, if someone tries to register to the UCM more than 3 times within 60 seconds, I'm going to tell the UCM to block that IP permanently. And then I can include the whitelist IPs or IP networks under this setting. I think the maximum number that is allowed is 5. No, it's actually 10 or more. Anyway, so you have a lot of options to include multiple IP networks and IP addresses in the whitelist or the fail to ban whitelist. And when you enable fail to ban, make sure you check that one, the asterisk, and you can specify the same number 3. And the fail to ban can also be used with failed login attempts. Earlier, I showed you the one that you configure in the user management. This one blocks the source IP address. The other one that I showed you under user management, it blocks the username, which means if you don't have that one enabled, but you have the other one, if someone tries to log in with admin, the UCM is going to block them, but if they try a different username, it's going to restart again, counting how many failed attempts. But this one, regardless of which username they're using, if the login attempt failed, the UCM is going to block them based on the source IP address. And if it happens that someone tried and they failed, you're going to see the IP address in here and the blacklist, and it's going to show you the type, if it's login or registration, the IP address, and also the operation, which is going to be failed. And last, we have the SSH access. If you're not using SSH, do not check that one. If you are using SSH, you can enable it. Use SSH when you're done and you feel or you think that you're not going to use SSH anymore. Just make sure you disable that one, because the more features that you enable on the UCM, the more ports you open for other people to attack your system. So I believe I've covered all the security features available on the UCM. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A area, and we still have some time to answer all your questions. And I see there are already some questions. So John is asking if the recording will be available. Yes, it is going to be available. I'm going to send you a copy of the recording as well as a copy of the presentation to all the people who attended this webinar. So the same thing for Terry. I'm going to send you the recording, and I'm going to send you also the slides so you can have a look at them. Okay. Okay, let me move next. David, is there a way to get the UCM to generate more complex passwords than the defaults set for the enable random password? I believe the passwords that are generated by the UCM, they are already complex passwords, but if you want, for example, to impose that the UCM uses a complex passwords, you can actually go to I believe it's under general. and just make sure that one is checked. I think it's checked by default, so that the UCM will only accept strong passwords. And if you hover that one, it's going to tell you, I believe it's 6 characters, which is the minimum accepted by the UCM to be considered strong and secure password. The length, as I just mentioned, it's limited to 6 characters, numbers, and special characters. And Lewis is asking about the the asterisk command available from SSH. I just want to let you know that SSH, or the commands available from SSH, are very limited. So when you access the UCM through the SSH, it doesn't mean that it's going to give you access to all the available commands.